This show is brought to you by our generous sponsors. Thank you for all your support in the production of this Career in STEM series. We are our first robotics team, 226 Hammerheads from Troy, Michigan, consisting of over 100 high school students from Troy High School and Athens High School. We've competed in the first robotics competition since 1999. This show is twice per month and on the first and Thursday of every single month. My name is Sonnet and I am a sophomore from Troy High School.
My name is Akul and I'm a sophomore from Troy High School as well. Elizabeth graduated from Troy High in 2015. She was on the robotics team for 3 years and was the information vice president her senior year. After high school, she attended Harvard College where she majored in government. Currently, she is attending Columbia Law School and has just finished her second year.
Hi, Elizabeth. You want to just start off and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. So I grew up in Macomb, but I went to high school in Troy. Both my parents immigrated from China and they owned their own jewelry business where I helped out a lot as a kid. And I think that was pretty crucial, helping me understand I want to be a lawyer. I like working with people. I like negotiating with customers. I like arguing and I like reading. So being a lawyer seemed like the obvious path for me.
So in high school, what activities did you do beyond just robotics?
So I did a lot of I did a lot of activities that included band, so marching band, symphonic band. I was in the poetry club, project lead. I took painting classes, piano classes, so quite a number of things.
So, I guess from your activities that you did in high school, which ones were sort of your favorite and why?
I mean, robotics was definitely a favorite, but I would say band was also very nice. I like the community. It was great being there every day. And I think music is just a really fun thing to do.
So what two activities help you prepare for college in general? What do you?
So my extracurriculars didn't like contribute directly to college just because I majored in government and all these things had to do with like science or music. But I did do two things over the summer before my senior year. I entered for Congressman Standard 11, who's now retired, and I also attended the Yale Young Global Scholars Program. And I highly recommend doing both activities if you can.
Yeah, that sounds like a really cool experience. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you went about getting these opportunities or what you did as a part of these programs and how you think that really helped you prepare for college?
Yeah, so Yale Young Global Scholars Program is just an application process. They have it all on their website, which is very helpful. Basically, it's like a mini version of like college. So we had actual law professors, and then we had a lot of readings. We even had a research project at the end. It was just fun, like meeting other people as well. You're like in the Yale dorms for 2 weeks. As for the internship with a congressman, so I kind of did that because my dad, I was looking for something to do. My dad was like, well, you might as well try. You just email them. So I emailed them with my resume saying I like to work there. And this was the district office. So Congress people have a district office like in their home state. Yeah, they also have an office in DC. So the DC office is a lot harder to get into unless you're in college or you have other connections. So I went for the district office first, and then I basically emailed my way in, interviewed with them, they liked me, and then once I did that, I actually went on to intern at their DC office later.
So just out of curiosity, how did the internship at the district office versus the DC office compare?
They're very different. So district office internships are usually about casework. So that means they're helping individual people with their needs. But that also means that as an intern, you actually can't really help a lot in that field since there's confidentiality issues. So I was doing a lot of like background work, like helping them organize things, a lot of responding to phone calls and emails, a little bit of research here and there. But not as substantive as working at the DC office. So the DC office, I was writing about like one memo every day. It was really fun. It would be like, oh, here's this bill that's coming up. The congressperson like wants like a short brief on the main issues and like who else is supporting it. And you just kind of write that brief for them. And I had a great supervisor. After she got that brief, she would just send it over. And then there were also a lot of really cool events. I got to hear Justice Ginsburg speak to everyone. I saw Nancy Pelosi. So it was just a good time.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great and interesting experience. So, just taking it back more to your 226 involvement in high school, could you describe your experience in 226? Maybe what you did or your favorite parts of it?
Yeah, so I am not a builder. I don't know engineering. I don't know computer science. So I kind of ended up on 226 because a friend really recommended it to me. So my main projects were more like secretarial. So I was actually the secretary for 1 year, and then I did information vice president. So a lot of spreadsheets, taking attendance, just making sure everyone completed the tasks that they said they were trying to complete. Overall, it was a lot of fun. I made a lot of friends through robotics, and I also got to work on code projects like chairman's. But occasionally it was frustrating, I think, being like more of the manager type. You had to just getting people to like kind of listen to you when they're your classmate can be a little difficult.
So at 226, what was your most like memorable moment?
So definitely the state competition. I unfortunately couldn't make the national competition. Probably would have been even more memorable, but it was very fun. We went to Craig's Cruisers afterwards, and then I remember once we like jumped into the hot tub with like all of our clothes on, like all the VPs just decided it would be a fun thing to do. We decorated our glasses with like rhinestones and such for the competition. Overall, it was a great weekend.
Yeah, so I also had another question. I know you talked about how you weren't really focusing too much on the actual building or the computer science, but being in a robotics team, such a STEM-heavy environment, were there any challenges or difficulties that you had to face as a female on the team, or just in general when you were in the robotics environment during competitions and more?
Mhm. So I guess you definitely know that you're one of the few females in the room, right? I've heard that the team's gotten better since then, overall. But back then, I think only about 10% were girls. And there was like an effort to like try to recruit more girls, but it's just harder. So I guess I didn't face like any challenges just because honestly, most of my friends are guys anyway, so it didn't make a difference. But I'm also like very outspoken, I think, whereas I know some girls like did tell me sometimes that they were feeling more intimidated or they felt like people weren't taking them seriously. So they definitely do exist.
So let's move on a little bit towards your major and college. So can you just talk a little bit about what you did at Harvard?
Yeah. So at Harvard, I majored in government, and I also was on the Harvard Crimson. I was in charge of the op-ed editing for a while. I also wrote columns and wrote my own op-eds. I also did the Harvard Institute of Politics Policy Group. So that's like basically I had to oversee 5 smaller groups who we got these commissions from like the state legislature, Congress, even Google. Basically had a policy problem that we would research and then hand that over to them at the end of the semester. So overall, I mean, I think Harvard has this like certain name brand about it that never goes away. But I would just have to say like the school itself is honestly very great. So I had a full ride financial aid. They covered so many other costs. Like I think I got $1,000 for winter coat my freshman year. When I studied abroad, they like gave me all the money I needed. Like when I went to Japan, they gave me like money for a flight, money for everything. Um, the student organizations, there's so many, and the professors are cool, right? They're like top of their field. The only downside is that sometimes they're not as good of a teacher because that's not what they're here to do. But I think like going to Harvard or honestly like any Ivy League, like high status private school, is that the people there can be very privileged, which is something that I didn't really think about going in. But I think, for example, I saw Harvard as an opportunity, right? And like everyone around me always talked about it as though it was an opportunity. But a lot of the people I knew saw it as a given. So they were like, oh, yeah, of course, I would end up at Harvard. And those are usually the people who also like have the best grades and have the most fun because they went to private schools that are a lot harder. So AP classes are hard, but they're nowhere near like the private school like curriculum, right? So I did actually struggle a little bit academically as well. But overall, like you get over it, you get through. Like mental health is definitely an issue, but it's something that you can work on.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So I guess if we talk a little bit more about your major, I know you majored in government, but could you explain more about what your major really is? Because I think a lot of the people we had before on this show were really STEM focused.
Yeah. So government is kind of a unique major. It doesn't exist in most schools. In most schools, you have political science and international relations. So government is basically those two combined, and that you're not really like forced to specialize in either or. You kind of just take classes in that area. So here's the pitch for majoring in government. I think, especially after this election, a lot of people say like, oh, like the government's corrupt or it's too divided or like, this is wrong with it, that is wrong with it. And that's very easy to say. Like anyone can look at something they don't understand and say, that's corrupt. Like, I don't like the outcome. So of course the process must be unfair. What I'm here to tell you is that that's honestly not true. I think that comes from a place of ignorance, if anything. So one example is that I often hear is that people are saying the Chinese government is, so authoritarian. There's no freedom of expression. And a lot of that's true. Like I have been censored on WeChat before, so I know. But for example, I did a whole study on how in China, a lot of protests are actually left alone. So when people protest, for example, so college students protest for better dorms, the government actually takes that very seriously and actually acts on it more often and quicker than American governments do to protest, which goes completely against what you would think about China. Chinese governments actually only repress protests that involve like broad swaths of people. So for example, if like college students and factory workers are protesting about the same thing, then they get worried. But if it's just one group of people protesting for one thing, they're actually very good about it. Meanwhile, democracy in the US is honestly like kind of falling apart. So the interest group lobbying is the worst in this country. And then there's gerrymandering, which really messes up like how the voting structure works. And of course, there's a lot of voter suppression even now. Like there are places, especially in the deep South, where the closest voting poll is like 36 miles away and no one has a car. So you're not voting if you're living in that area. So I think the cool thing about government is that after you take these courses, you realize that, like things are not as simple as you want to say it is. And that sometimes it's hard to make real change. Like it's not anyone's fault, really. It's just that everyone has something else that they care about. And a government, you're trying to make that all balance out. So even if you don't study government, I recommend taking at least one course to really understand what's happening.
Yeah, these topics are all very prevalent in the news nowadays, and the government seems to be a very key thing in trying to learn about these things in depth. So what other professional opportunities are there for someone that does learn about these stuff?
So law comes up as an obvious one. Other things that are obvious are like academia. You could do policy work, which I did a lot in college. You can work for the government, so like staffing congressional offices, doing research for the different departments, and then of course nonprofit work. They're always looking for government majors. So indirectly related though, because a lot of the things I named don't make a lot of money. Let's be honest here. Indirectly related, a lot of people I knew went into consulting. So consulting is kind of just like where you're hired to like do a deep dive into a company and then help them like do better. Finance, very indirectly related. But especially if you go to a top school and you study on the side by yourself, it's not a problem. And then of course, anything involving business like sales or marketing. But for those, you definitely have to work for it. Like you have to study ahead of time. You have to prove that your interest, you have to be proactive.
Since there's so many really interesting and cool professional opportunities available to someone with your major, how did you decide that you wanted to go into law school and not something else like finance or consulting or even academia?
Well, I don't like numbers, so finance was honestly right off the table immediately. In terms of academia, I'm not that kind of person. I'm not really interested in like researching long hours or going into that. I honestly really thought about going to policy work, but ultimately, I think I really missed the face-to-face aspect of the work, and then law just comes about as like the perfect balance, right? Like you're working with clients, but you're also have some time to do research. You're not always on your feet. Whereas consulting is like very much so you're always like with clients, and I didn't think I wanted that much client interaction.
So in college, what other organizations were you involved with?
So I already kind of touched on two of them. One other thing I did was volunteering. So we had this organization called the Phillips Brooks House Association, and within it there are like a lot of volunteer programs. One of which was Chinatown After School. So like I think people don't often think of Chinatown as like a needy like social aspect. I don't really know how to phrase it. But a lot of the people there are low income. They work long hours. There are a lot of language barrier issues. So a lot of these kids came in when they're 7 and they don't know English, right? Like, and now they're kind of forced into this public school system. After school, like half mentoring but half play kind of thing. So we of course like let the kids like have fun, but we also help them with their homework and try to like teach them something.
And then something else about, I guess, what you were involved in college. I know you touched on it a little bit about working at the DC office as an intern, but besides that, over the summer, what other things were you involved in your undergraduate years?
So the summer before sophomore year, I actually studied abroad in Japan. Highly recommend studying abroad at least like a summer, hopefully like a whole term. Like it is such a great experience to have. I can't emphasize that enough. And then the summer after that, I was at Heartland Alliance, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit. And then I was at the Center for American Progress, which is the largest liberal think tank that's in DC. So that was fun. Wrote like an article, got to attend a lot of events, and it was just a good time.
But speaking of your Japan learning abroad, can you speak a little bit more on what you did during the trip abroad?
Yeah. So I actually did 2 study abroad trips. So I'll talk about Japan first. So for Japan, it was kind of like a summer school situation. So I was taking 2 classes. One was on East Asian religions, the other was on Japanese history. And both of the teachers are great. And as part of our coursework, we're honestly only in class about 3 hours a day, some days even less. And we would go on field trips, and that was great. Imagine like just going to like one of the most famous temples in the world as in the afternoon as part of your trip. I stayed with a host family who I still hang out, like keep in touch with and talk to all the time. So they're great. It was just so fun. Like we always hung out. We always did something every day. We even did a trip to Tokyo at one point. So that was great. But that was overall, I think, like a very like hands-on kind of study abroad. Like the administration had like a lot of things planned out for us. So I also did study abroad at UCL in London. UCL is University College London. And that was a lot more hands-off. So you were kind of just put there. You were enrolled in classes like a normal student. But the thing is, I still travel a lot. I think I traveled every single weekend almost. I went to like Barcelona, I went to like Greece, I went to Italy, of course. And I just traveled with like other study abroad people. So for that, honestly, it wasn't really an academic experience, if I'm being honest. I was there to travel and to like have fun and all on my college, like financial aid. So it didn't cost me much.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So, how did you go about getting all of these different opportunities, whether it be summer school, like all these different study abroad opportunities, or even working with other nonprofits?
Yeah. So for study abroad, I mean, your school will have application systems. I think just be proactive, make sure you don't miss deadlines, and get started early. You don't want to be that person who is like, "Hi, professor, this application is due in 2 days. Could you write me a letter of recommendation?" Like, don't be that person, right? Like, just get it done early. It's not that hard. Whereas for internships, it's really different depending on like what you're trying to do. So for finance and consulting, it is actually very structured. So the firms will come like very early, I think September, and there's like a whole recruiting program where you like interview with all the firms at the same time, and then like you do callbacks, etc. Government jobs are actually much later. So most of them don't open until January. Some don't even open until like March. And then you apply and you don't hear back to like May, which is kind of stressful since you have to be there in June. And for that, you just Google, you ask around, you ask like people like what they think is like fun, what's worth doing, and you just apply. It's always good to have like an end, like if you know someone or if you're applying through a school program, that increases your chances by a lot. But definitely like just cold applications don't hurt either.
All right, so let's move a little bit from your undergraduate to now your law school. So what type of lawyers are there? Just basic.
Yeah. So there are 3 major types of lawyers. Okay, 2 major types. So, sorry. There are firm lawyers, which I'm going to talk about a bit. There are government lawyers, and then there are all of those like miscellaneous law jobs. So miscellaneous law jobs are probably the ones that people are actually more familiar with. So these are your personal injury lawyers, your immigration lawyers, your bankruptcy, debt collection, etc. Like the lawyers that you and I are most likely to be using since we're just individual clients. However, unfortunately, those are actually also the lawyers that don't really make much money. So I really don't recommend going to law school if that is your dream. That is totally a fine job to do if like you're really passionate about it or you're kind of retired. But I don't recommend that if like money is something, and procedure are things that you care about. So government jobs are the ones that you think about like in those courtroom dramas, right? Like you have your public defenders, you have your prosecutors, and there are also like a bunch of like random government lawyers that like people don't think about. For example, if the mayor's office is trying to do this project, they will need a lawyer to like recommend them on these things. So those are more interesting. They don't pay well, but they're very, very important, obviously. It's something I hope to do eventually. You're helping people, you're making the justice system work, right? And then we have our firm lawyers, which are you're probably least familiar with, but are actually very important. So this is kind of what I'm going into. I'm working at a firm for the summer right now, and I'm going to be working at one after graduation. So within firms, there's like two major subsections. So there's corporate law and then there's litigation. So litigation kind of happens when things go wrong, right? Like I don't know, Delta defaulted on its contract with like American Airlines. I don't know why they signed a contract, but say they defaulted and now they're going to sue. So as a litigation person, suing someone, especially a big company, is much more complicated than suing an individual, right? So when you're suing a big company, a lot of it's about discovery. So discovery is where you're like, oh, I want these documents. And through these documents, I will prove that you actually did something wrong. But I can't prove that unless I have those documents. So discovery can take years, like 2, 3, 4, 5 years we're talking. You go into court the whole time, you're negotiating settlements, and then if all of that fails, then you go to court, and that's like the actual court thing. And then the court cases can take forever. So litigation is like very long term. It's very conflict driven. Like you're really trying to like force the other side to do things your way. Corporate, on the other hand, is also called transactional work. Is all about contracts. So this is like before things go wrong. So this is when you're trying to make things happen. So say same thing, Delta and American Airlines are trying to sign a merger. So they're trying to become one company. So you're the one kind of helping them figure out how to structure that, not only to like improve the value and to make every side happy, but also just make sure like it's done correctly legally, because there are a lot of things with mergers. For example, you need to file with the government, certain documents, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much more like, like nice. And then in addition to corporate litigation, which are like the bulk of what firms do, there are smaller groups such as the tax group, which is kind of works with every single group to make sure the tax stuff is right. Real estate, that's self-explanatory. Bankruptcy, this means a lot more when it's a huge company than a small one. Trust in the states, that's like helping out rich people figure out what to do with their money. Intellectual property law, which I do want to talk about, because if you have a STEM background, this is really good for you. So to be an IP lawyer, especially a patent lawyer, so I don't know if you guys know what patents are, but they basically protect your inventions. You actually have to be licensed by the patent office federally. And in order to be like even qualified for that, you need an undergraduate degree at a minimum in a technical field. So that includes engineering, computer science, like biology. You get the point. Even better if you have a PhD or a master's. So if you are more of a STEM person and like you go into STEM in college, and at your senior year, you're kind of thinking to yourself, like, I actually don't really enjoy this. Or you work for 2 years and you're like, I don't like this. Law school is actually still an option for you. You can always go into law school. And it pays really well because there are so few people with that background, right? So yeah, anyways, firms overall, great, very, very prestigious place to work, at least if you're in a top firm. There are, of course, like smaller firms that are not so prestigious, and they pay really well. But the hours are very intense. Like you can totally be expected to pull all-nighters, but that is just how the work is.
The background that you gave us on the different types of lawyers was pretty interesting, and I know some of the viewers might be thinking about going into the law now or have already been thinking about that. So could you also elaborate a little bit more on what law school is really like, the difficulty, the different things that come up that people might not expect?
Yeah, so law school is 3 years. And basically, honestly, only the first year matters, especially well, it kind of depends. So if you're going the firm route, then that recruitment process happens the summer after your first year, which means only your grades in your first year matter. Everything else after that, you're kind of just like hanging out. So most law schools do this thing where they split their class into sections. I don't think Yale does this because they're really, really small. They're like 100 people. But all the other law firms, like Columbia Law is, I think, 400 some people per class. So we're split into 4 groups of 100 people. And you take all your classes with these people first year. So my section, like, I saw them every single day. And that's really nice. It almost has like a high school feel to it. But then there are also like people you can still meet outside of your section. So grades are done on a curve, which is a huge difference from undergrad, at least for most undergrads. You don't really know what grade you're going to get like coming out of an exam, which is a weird feeling, right? Like you know vaguely, you're like, okay, I didn't fail, but or you might know like, oh, I did really well. But most of the time you're kind of in between, you're like, okay, that could be a B plus, that could be an A minus. Really depends on like how other people did. You don't know. Um, there's only one exam at the end of the year, and that's 100% of your grade, which is quite stressful and not great if you're like one of those like short deadlines people and not long deadlines. So I'm very bad with that. So I kind of like push things off, whereas other people are bad about keeping up with the work. So that's what law school is like. There's this thing called cold calling, which is like you go to class, and every teacher does this differently, but most teachers will say like just randomly call someone for the day and they answer all the questions about the case. So that at least is like a slight incentive to do your work every single day. A lot of reading, that is what law school is. You're constantly reading. You have like 300, like not 300, you have like 100 pages of reading every day, which sounds more doable than it is just because the reading is very dense. So sometimes it takes you a lot longer than you think. Not as much writing as people think it is. We only had like one class where we were supposed to write, and that was like just to help us be better legal writers, not so much for a grade. Extracurricular activities in law school are very social. They're not really resume boosters. Like, okay, they help a little bit, but they're not, you don't do it for the resume like you would in high school. And they're all about affinity groups. So I was part of the women's organization, I was part of the Asian American organization, and you're just there to have fun. Last thing I want to point out is like people are very mature and nice. So they're not as competitive as the rumors say, at least not in a top law school. I think that has to do with the fact that like, even though we're graded on a curve, the fact that you see these people every day, like you know who's going to get that A. Like I knew, I was like, this person, he works maybe 5 times harder than me. Like he should get that A. Like you don't feel bad about it, right? And then especially if at the top firm, you're like, I will be fine either way. I have heard stories though at like lower ranked firms where like only the top 10%, I'm sorry, schools where only the top 10% really can go to a firm that can be much more competitive, right? Because you're all gunning for that same opportunity. So it really depends on where you go.
So law school sounds like it's very packed. There's a lot of stuff to do it. So to get in, what application process is there?
Very similar to college admissions, but honestly a little bit simpler. So you need a high LSAT score, although I think that is changing. They're constantly changing. Like LSAT's like kind of like the SAT, but now you can also do a GRE, I believe, which is like the general grad school exam. Some schools are trying to get rid of scores entirely, so I don't know how that's gonna be when you guys get there. You need a high college GPA, definitely. I think like, especially if, well, okay, less so if you're doing like STEM as an undergrad. But if you have like, you know, a more liberal arts background, a high GPA is necessary. And then you just need to write one personal statement, really, which is very different from college, right? College is all about like writing all of these endless essays. I remember it was very intense. But for law school, I wrote one personal statement. It was 2 pages. I changed the last paragraph to like reflect the school, and that's all I did. And that's kind of what they expect you to do. So it's a lot easier. Letters of recommendation, of course, and then some schools have a supplementary essay, but they're not like as long or as frequent. The most important difference is that law school application process is rolling admissions, so you should apply really early. Like the earlier you apply, the higher your chances are for getting in.
So, how did you choose a law school that you wanted to go to? Did you look into the different application processes, like the supplementary essays, or how did you sort of decide which scope you wanted to apply to?
So law schools, honestly, it's all about the ranking. That's just the unfortunate fact. Like they always talk about how there are too many lawyers for the number of jobs that is. And that is mainly because like, since law is different from STEM, right? For STEM, you go to the interview and they can really test you and be like, oh, do you know how to code this or do you not? And that determines if you get the jobs. They can't do that with lawyers because lawyers is all about like how well will you learn on the job. And a lot of being a lawyer is like just constantly relearning things. So for example, if I go into a project, I don't know anything about like, for example, this specific derivative, but I will have to learn that like in a day and then immediately be the expert on it. So it's all about your adaptability, which is why I think they care so much about like people going to good schools. So there's something called the T14 in law school, which just stands for the top 14. And that list is there. It hasn't really changed. But within the top 14, honestly, the top 6 are what you really want to aim for. So that's Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, and U Chicago. These are the schools where you go there and you can kind of do anything you want. It's easy to get into a firm. If you go into the government, you have a huge advantage. Like you're just in a good place. Whereas like if you're from lower in the T14, you're still in a good place, but you probably have to do a little better than average to get into a firm, especially. So it's a little bit harder. Whereas if you're below the T14, it's very hard. Like maybe you basically have to be top 10%, maybe even top 1% to get a firm job. You do not want to be in that position. So unless you're really sure, for example, that you want to be a prosecutor or like a government job where there's slightly less prestige focused, then you should probably just not go to law school if you don't get into a high ranking school. So that's a hard reality, but you can always apply. And if you get into school, go. If you don't, honestly, maybe don't go because it's a lot of money. It's 3 years of your life. There are other things you can do, right? And then the other thing to think about for law school is location. So this matters a lot because lawyers are all about your network. It's like, who do you know? Like, are you working with your friends? And so East Coast students tend to stay on the East Coast. So Harvard, Yale, and NYU and Columbia students go to New York. Some go to Boston, but most of them go to New York. And the Stanford kids and Berkeley kids go to state in California. Whereas the Midwest people are a little more scattered, but they tend to congregate in Chicago, although a good portion go to either coast. So that's more interesting, like you have more of a scattered network.
So you're currently in law school. So what internships are you doing right now?
So my first summer, I did a public interest internship and I had a legal services. That's just kind of what most people do after their 1L year because there are very few firm openings for 1Ls and it's very competitive. And honestly, I just didn't want to go for it. But then your second year internship is basically the job that you'll be having after you graduate. It's kind of like your job before senior year, I almost feeling. So I'm currently interning at Ropes and Gray, which is like this top 20 law firm known for their private equity work. They have about 1,400 lawyers and they have offices across the globe and China, Asia, I don't know. And they have about 60 practice areas that they work on.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to hear you talk about the firm that you're currently working for, which is obviously really prestigious. So I know you talked about how for law school, they start the recruiting process pretty early in to your, I guess, law school, so after 1 year. But for this one in particular, did you just have to go about obtaining your internship in a really formal application way, or was there another way that you got your job?
Yeah. So all law schools, I think, especially the top ones, have this thing called the on-campus interviewing program, which is where they invite firms to come in. It's usually a 3-day or 1-week process. And for example, Columbia, I can't speak for other schools, we have a bid list system. This was kind of complicated. So basically you rank all the firms that you want to have an interview for based on your interest level, but also based on the first field bid. So the firms don't look at anything when they do this. They literally just take students based on how high they rank. And some firms, for example, if you rank them number 1, you'll get the interview, but if you rank them number 2, you won't because that's how many people are interested. So it's honestly kind of like a mind game. It's a very complicated process. You don't need to get into it too much. But once that comes out, whatever interviews you get from that bid list, you do what's called a screener interview. And I did 15 of these over the course of 3 days. It was honestly very tiring. They're 15 or 20 minutes each. And they kind of they call it an interview, but honestly, the interview only accounts for about a third of their decision. The other 2/3 is determined by your resume and your grades. Grades are very important in law school, especially since you're graded on a curve, so that allows firms to really easily see where you are in your class. If they like what they see, they'll invite you back for a callback interview. So those are generally 2 to 3 hours, some are even 4 hours. And you're just meeting back to back with associates and partners. And then they're just really trying to get to know you. Is this someone I'm willing to pull an all-nighter with? That is a very important thing. Is this someone who can talk intelligently about certain issues? Is this someone I'd be okay putting in front of a client? That's really what they're trying to figure out. If they like you, then they will invite you back as a summer associate, and then that almost always becomes a full-time job.
So in these interviews, how did you go about just any tips for them, and what other things are involved in that?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into the very general tips eye contact and all that. You guys know this. But the most important piece of advice I have is that there are right answers So for any interview, there are right answers. Make sure you know what those answers are, because I totally messed that up. So one question that every partner asked me was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And the honest answer is, I don't know. Probably won't even be at the firm. Like, I'm not trying to stay there long term, right? But the right answer is not that answer. The right answer is, I see myself learning the business side of things and hopefully specializing in a certain group and maybe trying to make partner, right? That is the right answer. So figure out what those answers are. It's kind of when like, if like your college admissions counselor asks you like, oh, like, what do you like about the school? Don't say I don't like the school, right? Like that's not the right answer. Like, you know what the answers are. Do practice interviews. That's very helpful. Get honest advice. Don't do this with your friend. That's not useful. Your friend is your friend. You're not going to be serious about it. Generally, your schools will have like career counselors who are willing to like just sit down and pretend to be an interviewer, and they'll give you honest advice. They have nothing to lose. Research a company, make yourself attractive to them. So, for example, I also didn't do this as well as I could have, but like ropes is very heavy in private equity. That is their main field. So when they ask you, what fields are you interested in? The right answer is, I am interested in private equity as well as what you're actually interested in. But make sure you actually mention the things that they're recruiting for, because they probably have 100 spots open for private equity, but only 10 spots open for what you're actually interested in. And especially for law firms, it's different from other like jobs, I guess. Like you're going in, you do a whole summer. Some law firms even do a whole year before you actually decide what group you want to be in, and they usually like respect your choices. So get in first, and then you can like push for what you want. And same thing for try to get into law school. Like get into law school. Like some other piece of advice I have is like white lies are okay. Like it's okay to say that you're more interested in something than you actually are, or okay to say something what a challenge you solved was a little harder than it actually was. Don't lie. Like that is probably not a good idea. And like don't over exaggerate, but it's okay to dramatize things a little bit. That's how people get in.
So I think definitely a lot of people who are looking into getting into law are really interested in the actual salary, because it is so much work to get into a really good firm or just getting a really good job. So could you talk a little bit more about salary or salary negotiation?
So I can't really talk about salary negotiations since law firm salaries are fixed. So top law firms, and I'm talking about like almost all of the top 100 law firms in the US and even some of the top 200 pay what's called the market rate. And this is set by like the top firms. So that is 190K for first year law students. And this is New York, California, Chicago locations. Other locations don't pay as much. So the thing with law, like being a lawyer in general, you have to know is that if you're interested in practicing at a top firm, you're going to be in like New York or you're going to be in LA. Like maybe Chicago, maybe San Francisco, but you're not going to be anywhere else just because the market is not there, the CEOs are not there. So it's a great rate, right? 190K, that goes up about 30K every single year for the next like 8 years. And then once you're past either the 5th year or 8th year mark, depending on the firm, then your salary is dependent on your work. Once you're partnered, if you're what's called an equity partner, that's basically means you own part of the firm. So you just split that profit. Like you get a certain percentage of those profits, and that can be anywhere from like $500,000 a year to $3 million a year. Like you don't know. All depends on how well you do. So being a partner is kind of like being a CEO, because that's what law firms kind of are. So it's a great job. You also get like great benefits, like healthcare and all of that.
So this is a question from the chat. Was it harder to enroll to American college as a non-American?
Oh, I was born and raised in the US, so it's fine. But if you are non-American, a lot of my good friends are internationals in law school. I don't think I think the biggest thing I would be concerned about is language. So all the like international students I know are actually some of the top students. Their English is like better than mine, honestly, like especially in terms of reading and writing. But I do know 2 people who came in and their English was honestly not really great. Like they are great readers and writers, but they're not great speakers, and that definitely hurt them during the application process because, it's like it's awful, like it's unfortunate, but you can always see where the law firm is coming from. It's like, like if they feel uncomfortable having a conversation with you, how are you going to have a conversation with your client? Like, unfortunately, being a lawyer is very people focused. So that's just something to keep in mind.
It was so interesting to hear you talk about the different aspects of law school, becoming a lawyer, and your entire high school career. So I think just to wrap up a lot of the things that you discussed throughout our entire interview today, do you have any advice for high school students or high school robotics students in particular on maybe if they want to follow you and like sort of go into this field and pathway and what they should do to make the most of their time in high school and in college and beyond?
Yeah. I guess my major piece of advice is to always keep as many pathways open as possible. So for example, like don't make decisions where it's like, oh, once I make this decision, I can no longer switch out of this field and do something else. Like, for example, say I actually still wanted to policy work, but part of me was like, oh, maybe I want to be a lawyer, right? So it's once I like go into policy work and do that for a few years, I can't really become a lawyer at that point. Like I can apply later. And actually most law school students come in after 2 years of working. But once I've worked 10 years, like, the odds of that are very low. So what would be the safer option in that case is to go to law school first, see if you like it. If you really hate it, you can always go back to policy work, right? Like try to do things in a way where you're set up so that you can have the most options available. And obviously, like don't sell yourself short. I think something I've experienced with some of my friends is that they'll say like, oh, like, I don't know if I can take this class. Like, I feel like if I take this AP class, just take it. If you're a great stuffer, write an essay about it and explain that to your college admissions officer. But like, what if you did really well, right? And on that, like doing well, like ask for help. Like, for example, I am very, very, very bad at math, like phenomenally bad. I still managed to get a 5 in AP Calc. And I did that because I have two friends who I would make I would make them teach me math during like our breaks. I'd be like, you are helping me understand this, and that is fine. Like ask for help. Like I think I remember when I was in high school, like people saw asking for help as a sign of weakness. Like a lot of people actually thought I was pretty dumb. They were like, oh, like, yeah, like she's always asking people for help. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, why spend 2 hours trying to understand something yourself when someone can help you understand it in 15 minutes, right? Like that is the smarter thing to do. And especially as a lawyer, like in the field, there's so much emphasis on asking for help because someone else might be an expert. And instead of you making a mistake that could cost a client like $1 million, like you should just ask, like don't force yourself through anything.
All right, Elizabeth, thank you so much for this. We appreciate all the answers and information that you gave us. And thank you all for joining us today. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and come back in 2 weeks for our next show.